Everything you were taught about who built this place is almost certainly wrong, and for over a century that wasn't an accident. You are a stonemason, and the wall rising in front of you curves in a way that has no straight lines and no mortar holding it together, just granite blocks cut precisely enough to lock into place under their own weight. It will stand for longer than any government that ever claims to have built it. This is Great Zimbabwe, in the highlands of what is now southeastern Zimbabwe, and by the time it reaches its peak sometime in the 14th century, it will be home to as many as 18,000 people, the political and economic center of a trading kingdom controlling gold flowing out to the Swahili coast and, from there, across the Indian Ocean as far as China. You are building something that will outlast empires, using nothing but stone, gravity, and a level of engineering precision that took masons generations to perfect. Now here is the part that should genuinely make you angry, and it's worth pausing the story to sit in it for a moment, because if you find yourself wanting to know exactly how the people who built something this impressive got written out of their own history, sticking around and subscribing means you'll keep running into this same pattern, because this channel exists specifically to trace it. Let's stay with you a moment longer, because the wall itself tells you something the later disputes never could. You are working on what will eventually be called the Great Enclosure, a curved outer wall that will eventually stand over 11 meters high and stretch some 250 meters around, built entirely from granite blocks split from natural rock outcrops nearby, shaped by hand, and fitted together in tight, level courses without a single drop of mortar. The technique has a name today, dry stone construction, and it requires exactly the kind of skill you're demonstrating right now. Judging the natural grain of the granite, splitting blocks along it rather than against it, and stacking each course so its own weight locks the one below it into place. Get it wrong and the wall bulges and eventually collapses. Get it right the way you and generations of masons before and after you did, and it stands essentially forever, needing no repair beyond the occasional lost stone. For nearly a century after European colonizers first encountered these ruins in the late 1800s, the official position of the colonial government in what was then called Rhodesia was that Africans could not have built Great Zimbabwe. Colonial administrators, missionaries, and amateur explorers proposed the Queen of Sheba, Phoenician traders, Arab merchants, virtually any explanation except the one sitting in front of them, that a sophisticated Bantu-speaking African civilization had engineered and governed this place themselves. This wasn't a fringe theory whispered by a few cranks. It was, for decades, the enforced official line, because acknowledging African builders directly undermined the entire colonial justification for taking the land in the first place. So which is it? Let's actually look at both explanations the way real archaeology eventually did. The colonial version rested on almost nothing. No systematic excavation, no comparison to other regional stone architecture, mostly just the assumption, stated outright by figures like the explorer Karl Mach in the 1870s, that local Africans were incapable of this level of construction. That assumption collapsed the moment anyone actually did the archaeological work properly. The archaeologist Gertrude Caton-Thompson led a rigorous excavation at the site in 1929, and her conclusion was direct and unambiguous. The pottery, the artifacts, the construction techniques, all of it matched local African Iron Age traditions, with no evidence whatsoever of outside builders. She stated it plainly enough that it should have settled the debate on the spot. It didn't, not politically, because Rhodesia's government spent decades afterward suppressing, ignoring, or actively censoring that conclusion in school textbooks and official publications, precisely because the political implications were too inconvenient. Decades later, the British archaeologist Peter Garlake conducted more extensive excavations and radiocarbon dating across the site, and his research reinforced Caton-Thompson's findings with much deeper evidence. Construction phases spanning centuries, a clear local architectural evolution you can trace stone by stone, and connections to earlier and later stone-building traditions across the region. Garlake later wrote candidly about how politically dangerous his own findings had become in white minority-ruled Rhodesia, where stating the obvious that Africans built Great Zimbabwe could cost a researcher their career. That's theory one, thoroughly discredited, sustained for a century not by evidence but by political convenience. Theory two, the actual African origin, is now the settled scholarly consensus, confirmed independently by multiple researchers using multiple methods across multiple decades. But here's where the real mystery of Great Zimbabwe actually lives, and it's a different question entirely. Not who built it, but why, sometime in the 15th century, its population left. The archaeologist Thomas Huffman, who has spent decades studying the site's spatial layout, argues that Great Zimbabwe functioned partly as a ritual and political center organized around ideas of sacred kingship and rainmaking, structures and enclosures arranged to reflect a specific cosmological worldview. If that reading is right, it means the city's authority depended not just on controlling trade, but on the ruling elite's perceived ability to secure rain and prosperity for the kingdom, a legitimacy that becomes catastrophically fragile the moment the climate stops cooperating. Picture what that means for you, standing among the stone enclosures decades after your own work on the walls is finished. A prolonged dry spell settles over the highlands. Crops that fed a city of thousands begin failing. Cattle herds, the other pillar of the kingdom's wealth, start dying off from overgrazed, exhausted pastureland that a population this size had been pressing against for generations. If Huffman's framework holds, this isn't just an economic problem. It's a legitimacy crisis for a leadership whose authority was partly built on the promise of exactly this kind of provision. Think about what that would have actually looked like decade by decade, rather than as a single dramatic turning point. Cattle are wealth here in a very literal sense, the primary store of value and the primary marker of status, the way land or currency might function elsewhere. When grazing land starts giving out, herders don't abandon their herds overnight. They push them further onto marginal ground that recovers more slowly each season, the same overextension pattern that shows up again and again across very different collapse stories on this channel, a system quietly consuming the margin that used to protect it from exactly this kind of shock. A ruler whose legitimacy rests partly on rainmaking authority doesn't lose that authority in a single bad harvest either. It erodes gradually, one poor rainy season stacked on another, until the sacred kingship that once felt unquestionable starts to look, to enough people at once, like a promise that simply isn't being kept anymore. The archaeologist Innocent Pikirayi, whose research focuses on the broader trajectory of Zimbabwean stone-building states, points to a second, compounding pressure operating alongside any environmental strain, a shift in the regional gold trade itself. As Swahili coastal city-states and their trading partners reoriented around new routes and new political relationships, the flow of gold and prestige goods that had underwritten Great Zimbabwe's wealth for generations began moving elsewhere, toward newer centers of power like Kami, further west. A kingdom whose authority rested on controlling a trade network doesn't need that network to disappear entirely to be destabilized. It just needs the network to start routing around it. Environmental strain on one side, a trade network quietly rerouting on the other. Neither one alone fully explains why a city this sophisticated emptied out within a few generations, but together, compounding each other the way stress compounds in any system running close to its limits, they offer the best supported explanation archaeology currently has, far more convincing than the colonial fantasy that dominated the conversation for 100 years, and honestly still more interesting than a simple invasion story would have been. So think about what actually happened here at both ends of this story. For a century, the question of who built Great Zimbabwe was answered with confident, politically convenient nonsense, while the actual, far more interesting question, why its people eventually left, sat mostly unexamined, because nobody in power particularly wanted to fund research that started from the premise that Africans had built something worth studying in the first place. That should sit uncomfortably with you, and not just as a fact about 19th century Rhodesia. Because the same mechanism, a confident, politically convenient explanation crowding out the harder, better supported one, doesn't require colonial racism specifically to operate. It just requires an audience that would rather have a simple story than an accurate one, and enough authority behind the simple version that nobody feels safe correcting it out loud. You are the stonemason who built a wall precise enough to outlast every government that ever claimed the credit for it. The wall is still standing. The question worth sitting with is how many other walls, other stories, other builders are still waiting for someone to finally ask who actually put them there.